Section 8 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Matilda of Scotland, Chapter 1, Part 2. Henry was regarded by the people of the land with a greater degree of complacency than the elder sons of the Conqueror, from the circumstance of his being an English-born prince. While yet a tender infant, his mighty sire named him as a witness, the only male witness, of the following curious chapter to one of his followers, the founder of the family of Hunter of Hopton. I, William the King, the 3rd year of my reign, give to thee, Norman Hunter, to me that art both life, loving, and dear, the hop and the Hopton and all the bounds up and down, under the earth to hell, above the earth to heaven, from me and mine to thee and thine, as good and as fair as ever they mine were. To witness that this is sooth, I bite the white wax with my tooth, before Juga, Maud, and Marjorie, and my young son Henry, for a bow and a broad arrows, when I shall come to hunt on Yarrow. The rhymes of this quaint feudal grant are undoubtedly far more agreeable to the ear than the halting heroics of honest Robert of Gloucester, previously quoted, though compounded more than a century before his jingling chronicle was written. Several of the charters of William the Conqueror are in this form, and with the names of the same members of his family. It is probable that they were executed in the presence of his queen, Maud. Juga, sometimes used as an abbreviation for Judith, must have been his niece Judith, afterwards the wife of Waltheow, and Marjorie, a daughter, who is sometimes enumerated in his family by the chroniclers. And to these the name of that notable witness, the baby Henry, was doubtless added as a joke by the royal sire. Biting the white wax was supposed to give particular authenticity to conveyances from the crown, which were formerly each duly furnished with a proof impression of that primitive substitute for the Great Seal of England, the royal eye-tooth, sometimes familiarly specified by the monarch as his fang tooth. This custom, which took its rise from very remote antiquity, was needlessly adopted by the Anglo-Norman line of sovereigns, whose broad seals are peculiarly fine workmanship, bearing their veritable effigies crowned, sceptred, and in royal robes, seated on the king's stone bench. And on the reverse of the seal the same monarch is figured, armed cap a pie, and mounted on a war charger, gallantly appointed. Such are the impressions affixed to all their charters. It is among the boasts of Cambridge that Henry, so celebrated for his learning, received his education there. The ancient annals of St. Austin's, Canterbury, however, affirm that he was instructed in philosophy beyond seas, where, for his knowledge in the liberal sciences, he was by the French surnamed Beauclerc. The following dialogue took place between Henry and his royal sire, when the latter lay on his deathbed at Hermintrude, and was concluding his elaborate confession of his past deeds of oppression and cruelty, with the verbal bequest of his dominions on his 2 eldest sons. "And what do you give me, father?" interrupted Henry, who stood weeping at the bedside, less touched, we fear, at the awful list of sins and weaknesses of which his dying sire had just disburdened his conscience, than at the tenor of a last will and testament in which he appeared to have no share. £5,000 in silver, out of my treasury, do I give thee," replied the Conqueror. "But what shall I do with treasure, if I have neither castle nor domain?" demanded the disappointed prince. "Be patient, my son, and comfort thyself in God," rejoined the expiring monarch. "Thy elder brothers do but go before thee. Robert shall have Normandy, and William England. But thou shalt be the inheritor of all my honors, and shall excel both thy brethren in riches and power." This oracular speech, though far enough from proving satisfactory at the time to the landless Henry, was afterwards magnified to a prophetic annunciation of his accession to the united dominions of England and Normandy. Discontented as Henry was with the paternal legacy, he was in such haste to secure its payment, that he left the last duties of the remains of his royal sire to the care of strangers, while he flew to make his claim upon the treasury of the departed sovereign, rightly judging that unless he forestalled his elder brethren in taking possession of the bequest, his chance of receiving it would be but small. In fact, Robert, whose extravagance had exhausted all his resources before he succeeded to the dukedom of Normandy, besought his youngest brother to assist him with a loan of at least part of the money. Henry, who had all the worldly wisdom of a premature statesman, complied, on condition of being put in possession of his mother's bequest of the Cotentin. Robert agreed, but after he had been foiled in his attempt to dethrone Rufus, he returned to Normandy with exhausted coffers, and wrongfully repossessed himself of the Cotentin. Henry, greatly enraged at this treatment, was preparing to take up arms against Robert, when the latter, finding himself attacked by William, and abandoned by his false ally, Philip of France, thought proper to make the most earnest solicitations to Henry for assistance, and forgiveness for the late outrage of which he had been guilty. Henry, being mollified by the submission of his elder brother, and understanding that a plot was in agitation to deliver Rowan to William, suddenly entered the city, and seizing Conan, the head of the conspirators, charged him with treason to the duke, and caused him to be flung headlong from one of the highest towers. By this decisive step, Henry preserved the capital for Robert. Robert and William soon after came to an amicable agreement, and, conceiving a sudden affection for each other, they terminated their quarrel by making their wills in each other's favor, without any mention of Henry. Henry regarded this as a great affront, especially on the part of Robert, to whom he had rendered such signal services, and demanded of him either a restitution of his silver, or to be put in possession of the Cotentin. On Robert's refusal, he seized on Mount St. Michael, where he strongly entrenched himself. The youthful adventurer maintained his rocky fortress with obstinate valor, against the united efforts of his august brothers of England and Normandy, till he was reduced to the greatest straits for want of water. He presented his distress to Robert in a moving message, and obtained leave to supply his garrison with water, and a present of wine for his own use. Rufus upbraided Robert with his compliance, which he called an act of folly. "What?" replied Robert, with a sudden burst of that generous warmth of feeling which formed the redeeming trait of his character. "Is the quarrel between us and our brother of that importance that we should make him die of thirst? We may have occasion for a brother hereafter, but where shall we find another if we destroy this?" After Robert had besieged St. Michael's Mount during the whole of Lent, he brought Henry to terms, who, weary perhaps of keeping a stricter fast than even the Church of Rome enjoined at that season, surrendered the fortress, and having permission to go whither he pleased, wandered about Germany and France for some time, forsaken of everyone save 4 faithful domestics, by whom he was attended. In the year 1094 we find, from Matthew Paris, that Henry was in England, and employed by William Rufus, in assisting to quell the formidable rebellion of Robert Mowbray, the Lord of Northumberland. Prince Henry's poverty, and dependence on the caprices of his brother, the Red King, subjected him occasionally to the sneers of the wealthy Norman barons, but more especially of his kinsman and rival, Warren, who took occasion, from his swiftness in pursuit of the forest game, which ofttimes, says the Chronicle of Normandy, he, for lack of horse or dog, followed on foot, to bestow the name of Deersfoot on the landless prince. This greatly troubled Henry, who hated Warren to the death, but had no power to avenge himself, because the Red King loved Warren greatly. It is possible that Warren's courtship of Matilda of Scotland was one cause of Henry's bitter animosity. This courtship was sanctioned by Rufus, and some of the ancient chroniclers assert that Matilda was contracted to him, but this appears without foundation. Henry was in his 32nd year, when the glancing aside of Wat Tyrrell's arrow made him king of England. The chroniclers of that era record that, from whatever cause, omens, dreams, and predictions of the death of the Red King were rife in the land, immediately preceding that event. Prince Henry was at this fatal hunting party, and Wace, the minstrel chronicler of the Norman line of princes, relates a most remarkable adventure that befell him on this occasion. Prince Henry being separated from the royal party, while pursuing his game in an adjoining glen of the forest, chanced to snap the string of his crossbow, or arblast, and repairing to the hut of a forester, to get it mended or replaced, he was, the moment he entered this sylvan abode, saluted as king by an old woman whom he found there, whose description is somewhat similar to that of one of the witches in Macbeth. The following is a literal version of her address, from the Norman French rhymes of Wace. Hasty news to thee I bring, Henry, thou art now a king. Mark the words and heed them well, which to thee in sooth I tell, and recall them in the hour of thy regal state and power. Before Henry had recovered from the surprise with which the weird woman's prediction had startled him, the cries of the Red King's attendants proclaimed the fatal accident that had befallen their royal master, and the hasty flight of the unlucky marksman by whose erring shaft he had died. Prince Henry acted as Rufus doubtless would have done in his case. He sprang to his saddle, and made the best of his way to Winchester, without bestowing a moment's care or attention on the body of his deceased brother, which was irreverently thrown into the cart of one Purkis, a Saxon charcoal burner, that was passing through the forest, and, on no gentler briar, was ignobly borne back to the city which he had quitted that morning with such proud parade. Robert of Gloucester relates the circumstance with his usual quaint minuteness, and among a number of his lame and tame lines, the following graphic couplet occurs, which we think our readers will consider worthy of quotation. To Winchester they bare him, all midst his green wound, and ever as he lay the blood welled to ground. William Bretuil, the royal treasurer, was also at this memorable hunting party, and with him Prince Henry actually rode a race to Winchester, ay, and won it too, for when Bretuil arrived at the door of the treasury, he found Prince Henry standing before it, who greeted him with a demand of the keys. Bretuil boldly declared, that both treasure and crown belonged to the prince's eldest brother, Duke Robert of Normandy, who was then absent in the Holy Land, and for that prince he would keep the treasure of the late king his master. Then Henry drew his sword, and, backed by his powerful friend, Henry Bellomont, afterwards Earl of Leicester, and other nobles of his party, forced the keys from his kinsman Bretuil, and took possession of the treasure and regalia. Bretuil loudly protested against the wrong that was done to Duke Robert. Some of the nobles who possessed large estates in Normandy sided with Bretuil in advocating the rights of the royal crusader, and the debate growing very stormy, it was considered more expedient to argue the momentous question in the council chamber. Thither the nobles and prelates adjourned, but while they were engaged in advocating, according as interest or passion swayed, the rival claims of Robert and Henry to the vacant throne, the majority being inclined for the elder brother, the brave but proverbially unready Robert, Henry had successfully pleaded his own cause to the populace in the streets of Winchester, and they, strong in numbers, and animated with sudden affection for the English-born prince, who had promised to bestow upon them English laws and an English queen, gathered round the palace, and quickened the decision of the divided peers in council by making the name of Henry resound in their ears. And Henry, thus elected by the voice of the people, was immediately proclaimed king at Winchester. The remains of the luckless Rufus were hurried into the grave with a sort of hunter's mass the following morning, at an early hour, in Winchester Cathedral, and Henry hastened to London, where, on Sunday, the 9th of August, the third day after his brother's death, he was crowned in Westminster Abbey by Maurice, Bishop of London. Before the regal circlet was placed on his brow, Henry, at the high altar at Westminster, promised to God and the people, says the Saxon Chronicle, to annul the unrighteous acts that took place in his brother's reign, and he was crowned on that condition. Henry promised everything that could reasonably be demanded of him, and set about reforming the abuses and corruptions that had prevailed during the licentious reign of the bachelor king, and completely secured his popularity with the English people. by declaring his resolution of wedding a princess of the blood of Alfred, who had been brought up and educated among them. Accordingly he demanded Matilda, the daughter of Malcolm, king of Scotland, and Margaret Atheling, of her brother Edgar, king of Scotland. The proposal was exceedingly agreeable to the Scottish monarch, but great difficulties were opposed to the completion of this marriage, by those who were of the opinion that she had embraced a religious life. The abbess Christina, Matilda's aunt, in particular, whose Saxon prejudices could not brook the idea that the throne of the Norman line of sovereigns should be strengthened by an alliance with the royal blood of Alfred, protested, that her niece was a veiled nun, and that it would be an act of sacrilege to remove her from her convent. Henry's heart was set upon the marriage, but he would not venture to outrage popular opinion by wedding a consecrated nun. In this dilemma he wrote a pressing letter to the learned Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been unjustly despoiled of his revenues by William Rufus, and was then in exile at Lyons, entreating him to return, and render him his advice and assistance in this affair. When Anselm heard the particulars of the case, he declared that it was too mighty for his single decision, and therefore summoned a council of the church at Lambeth, for the purpose of entering more fully into this important question. Matilda made her appearance before the synod, and was closely interrogated by the primate Anselm, in the presence of the whole hierarchy of England, as to the reality of her alleged devotion to a religious life. The particulars of her examination have been preserved by Edmer, who, as the secretary of the Archbishop Anselm, was doubtless an eyewitness of this interesting scene, and, in all probability, recorded the very words uttered by the princess. The archbishop commenced by stating the objections to her marriage, grounded on the prevailing report that she had embraced a religious life, and declared that no motive whatever would induce him to dispense with her vow, if it had already been given to Almighty God. The princess denied that there had been any such engagement on her part. She was asked if she had embraced a religious life, either by her own choice or the vow of her parents, and she replied, neither. Then she was examined as to the fact of her having worn the black veil of the votaress in her father's court, and subsequently in the nunneries of Rumsey and Wilton. I do not deny, said Matilda, having worn the veil in my father's court, for when I was a child, my aunt Christina put a black cloth over my head. But when my father saw me with it, he snatched it off in a great rage, and execrated the person who had put it on me. I afterwards made a pretense of wearing it, to excuse myself from unsuitable marriages, and, on one of these occasions, my father tore the veil and threw it on the ground, observing to Alan, Earl of Bretagne, who stood by, that it was his intention to give me in marriage, not to devote me to the church. She also admitted that she had assumed the veil in the nunnery of Rumsey, as a protection from the lawless violence of the Norman nobles, and that she had continued to wear that badge of conventual devotion, against her own inclination, through the harsh compulsion of her aunt, the abbess Christina. If I attempted to remove it, continued Matilda, she would torment me with harsh blows and sharp reproaches, sighing and trembling. I wore it in her presence, but as soon as I withdrew from her sight, I always threw it off, and trampled upon it. This explanation was considered perfectly satisfactory by the Council of Lambeth, and they pronounced that Matilda, daughter of Malcolm, king of Scotland, had proved that she had not embraced a religious life, either by her own choice or the vow of her parents, and she was therefore free to contract marriage with the king. The council, in addition to this declaration, thought proper to make public the most cogent reason which the Scottish princess had given for her assumption of the black veil on her coming to England, which was done in the following remarkable words. When the great King William conquered this land, many of his followers, elated by so great a victory, and thinking that everything ought to be subservient to their will and pleasure, not only seized the provisions of the conquered, but invaded the honor of their matrons and virgins whenever they had an opportunity. This obliged many young ladies, who dreaded their violence, to put on the veil, to preserve their honor. According to the Saxon chroniclers, Matilda, notwithstanding her repugnance to the consecrated veil, exhibited a very maidenly reluctance to enter the holy pale of matrimony with a royal husband. It is possible that the report of the immoral tenor of Henry's life, before he ascended the throne, which was evidenced by his acknowledging the claims of 20 illegitimate children, might be regarded by a princess of her purity of mind and manners as a very serious objection, and if, as many of the early chroniclers intimate, there had been a previous engagement between Henry and herself, she of course felt both displeasure and disgust at his amours with the beautiful Nesta, daughter of the Prince of Wales, and other ladies too numerous to particularize. It is certain that after the council at Lambeth had pronounced her free to marry, Matilda resisted for a time the entreaties of the king, and the commands of her royal brother and sovereign, to accept the brilliant destiny which she was offered. All who were connected with the Saxon royal line importuned Matilda meantime with such words as these: "O most noble and most gracious woman, if thou wouldest, thou couldst raise up the ancient honour of England. Thou wouldest be a sign of alliance, a pledge of reconciliation. But if thou persistest in thy refusal, the enmity between the Saxon and Norman races will be eternal. Human blood will never cease to flow." Thus urged, the royal recluse ceased to object to a marriage, whereby she was to become the bond of peace to a divided nation, and the dove of the newly sealed covenant between the Norman sovereign and her own people. Henry promised to confirm to the English nation their ancient laws and privileges, as established by Alfred and ratified by Edward the Confessor, in short, to become a constitutional monarch, and on those conditions the daughter of the royal line of Alfred consented to share his throne. Matthew Paris says positively that Matilda was a professed nun, and so averse to this marriage that she invoked a curse upon all the descendants that might proceed from her union with the Norman king. But this is contradicted by all other historians, and if any foundation existed for the story, we think friend Matthew must, by a strange slip of the pen, have written down the name of the meek and saintly Matilda instead of that of the perverse virago, the Abbess Christina, her aunt, who was so greatly opposed to those auspicious nuptials, and, for aught we know, might have been as much addicted to the evil habit of imprecation as she was to scolding and fighting. Matilda's demurs, after all, occasioned little delay, for the Archbishop Anselm did not return to England till October. The council at Lambeth was held in the latter end of that month, and her marriage and coronation took place on Sunday, November 11th, being St. Martin's Day, just 3 months and 6 days after the inauguration of her royal lord at Westminster, August 5th, 1100, which we may consider quick work for the dispatch of such important business and solemn ceremonies of state. We give the singular scene of the marriage in the very words of one who was a contemporary, and most likely an eyewitness. At the wedding of Matilda and Henry I, there was a most prodigious concourse of nobility and people assembled in and about the church at Westminster, when, to prevent all calumny and ill report that the king was about to marry a nun, the Archbishop Anselm mounted into a pulpit, and gave the multitude a history of the events proved before the synod, and its judgment, that the Lady Matilda of Scotland was free from any religious vow, and might dispose of herself in marriage as she thought fit. The Archbishop finished by asking the people in a loud voice, whether any one there objected to this decision, upon which they answered unanimously, with a loud shout, that the matter was rightly settled. Accordingly the lady was immediately married to the king, and crowned before that vast assembly. A more simple yet majestic appeal to the sense of the people in regard to a royal marriage, history records not. To this auspicious union of the Anglo-Norman sovereign Henry I with Matilda of Scotland, a princess of English lineage, English education, and an English heart, we may trace all the constitutional blessings which this free country at present enjoys. It was through the influence of this virtuous queen that Henry granted the important charter, which formed the model and precedent of that great palladium of English liberty, Magna Carta, and we call upon our readers to observe that it was the direct ancestress of our present sovereign lady who refused to quit her gloomy conventual prison, and to give her hand to the handsomest and most accomplished sovereign of his time, till she had obtained just and merciful laws for her suffering country, the repeal of the tyrannical imposition of the curfew, and, in some slight degree, a recognition of the rights of the commons. When the marriage of Matilda of Scotland with Henry I. took place, 100 copies of this digest of the righteous laws of Alfred and Edward the Confessor were made, and committed to the keeping of the principal bishoprics and monasteries in England. But when these were sought for, in the reign of John, to form a legal authority for the demands of the people, Rapin says, only one could be found, which was exhibited to the barons by Cardinal Langton. This was, in fact, the simple model on which Magna Carta was framed. It is supposed that Henry I., after Matilda's death, destroyed all the copies, on which he could lay his hands, of a covenant which, in the latter years of his reign, he scrupled not to infringe whenever he felt disposed. Harding, after recording the death of the Red King, relates the accession of Henry I. and his marriage with Matilda of Scotland in the following rude stanzas. Henry, his brother, the first king of that name, was crowned with all the honour that might be. He reconciled St. Anselm who came home, and crowned Maud his wife full fair and free. That daughter was full of benignity to King Malcolm and St. Margaret the Queen of Scotland, which afore that time had been, of whom he gat William, Richard, and Mold, whose goodness is yet spoken of full wide. If she were fair, her virtues manyfold exceeded far, all vice she set aside. Debates that were engendered of pride she set at rest with all benevolence, and visited the sick and poor with diligence. The prisoners and women eke with child, lying in abject misery about, clothes, meat, and bedding new and undefiled, and wine and ale she gave withouten doubt, when she saw need in countries all throughout. Those crosses all that yet be most royal in the highways, with gold she made them all. End of section 8.